Gonzaga is officially joining the Pac-12 and is immediately the premier school in the rebuilt conference.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday and welcome into a special live edition of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I am Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade over there, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. Folks, want to thank you all for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord. Got a little heads up that we were going live today to talk about the exciting news of the day, Gonzaga joining the Pac-12 Conference. Folks, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet now, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. We are all over Gonzaga to the Pac-12 news today. Broke Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Pacific time. The Zags released a press release indicating their plan to join the Pac-12 conference. We're going to talk about all the details. Good move for the Zags, bad move for the Zags. What does it mean for the Pac-12? What might be the next steps for that conference? Could they continue to pursue potentially building more of a basketball-focused league? We're also going to talk a little bit about what this means for the WCC losing their premier brand in Gonzaga as well. Isaac, why don't you give us just some of the quick and dirty details of what this move means or what's going on with this move, and we'll start talking about some of the other details as well.
Quick and dirty details, Andy. That's what I do best, my friend. And yes, folks, this time it's real. This time it's happening. Gonzaga officially to the Pac-12. This is in all sports. This will be effective as of July 1st, 2026, when all the schools are coming over. Remember, we've got this kind of 2-year situation going on with, oddly enough, Oregon State and Washington State in the West Coast Conference with Gonzaga. It's hilarious, and I love it. This got, from the Gonzaga press release on it, quote, unanimous approval from the conference board of directors and its 5 new member presidents, meaning the 5 schools that are coming over from the Mountain West Conference. The current makeup, Andy, of the rebuilt Pac-12, I'll go alphabetically here, is Boise State, Colorado State, Fresno State, Gonzaga State, Oregon State, yes, that's a joke, San Diego State, Utah State, and Washington State. So we've got 8 schools. Gonzaga, the current non-football member. Obviously, that's going to be a massive part of our conversation today. By the way, someone legitimately asked me this earlier, and so I do want to just clear it up. No, all sports does not mean Gonzaga is adding football. It just by Gonzaga is coming to the Pac-12 in all sports, meaning that all of Gonzaga's current sports are moving to the Pac-12. There's not some staying with the West Coast Conference or going somewhere else. That's what all that means. And then, Andy, obviously the big other talking point we'll have to get to that most folks are probably aware of is the Pac-12 will still need to find an 8th football playing school to add in all sports. That's a key part of this to make it FBS viable. So, Andy, obviously the question in all of this, the reason for all of this conference realignment is the almighty Benjamin, the greenback, the dollars. Could you just fill us in some on the money situation going on with all of this?
Yeah, we don't know a ton of specific details because we don't know what the media deal is going to look like for the Pac-12. Obviously, they have not negotiated that, and they're still working on building out the rest of the conference. But a report from Matt Norlander of CBS indicates that Gonzaga is expected to get something close, is the way it was phrased, to a full rev share in the new Pac-12. And for those who've been following this story and remember the false report a week ago that indicated Gonzaga had already accepted an invitation to the Pac-12, at that time it was reported that they were accepting a full rev share into the Pac-12. That report was debunked, and then now a week later they are joining the conference, and we haven't heard anything completely conclusive about whether Gonzaga is going to get a full share as a non-football member or not. I think that's the big question right now. I don't expect Gonzaga would join a new conference when they've been picky about this in the past. They turned down the Mountain West previously. They wouldn't have done this if they didn't feel that the financial the financial impact for the university would be significantly improved. And part of that is likely going to be getting close to or at a full rev share. We also know, if this is per Chris Vanini of The Athletic on Twitter, I'm just going to read his tweet directly. He says, the conference's written agreement says schools will keep 50% of their NCAA tournament unit money, with the remaining 50% spread equally. So this is a big deal because Gonzaga in the WCC, one of the reasons that they didn't jump to the Mountain West back in 2018 when the Mountain West unanimously voted to approve Gonzaga as a member, but Gonzaga stayed in the WCC, was because they were getting a huge chunk of the unit, the money from the units, because a lot of the time they were the only team from the WCC making the NCAA tournament. So they said, why should this money be being split amongst these other schools when they're not making the tournament? And so Gonzaga had a really cushy deal with the WCC, still does for the next couple of years. But in order to convince them to leave what was a very kind of advantageous situation for them, it sounds like the Pac-12 is willing to allow the schools that actually make and contend for NCAA tournament spots regularly. They're going to make some more money out of that as well. So we may not know full-on dollar figures, but it sure sounds like Gonzaga set themselves up in a position where this is going to be pretty financially advantageous for them.
Andy, quick question. We got actually a question in our comments literally about what you just mentioned. I wonder if you know the answer to this. Mark is asking basically exactly what you just laid out for us. Plus, he's wondering, how does that compare with the current weighted WCC split right now? Do you know the numbers on that or their percentages?
I don't know them off the top of my head. I would have to look and see. But again, I think part of the equation here is that they're likely year in and year out going to be more teams from the new Pac-12 making the NCAA tournament than there were in the WCC. So in theory, that should help. The rest of that money is going to get split 50%, spread equally. So for Gonzaga, they get 50% of their money from how many games they win in the tournament. But if San Diego State goes on a run to the Elite Eight and Boise State makes the Sweet 16 and Colorado State wins a game, the rest of that money gets spread out among all the schools, including Gonzaga. So in the WCC, their percentage is higher than 50%. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but most years, the only other team that makes it is St. Mary's. Sometimes they advance, sometimes they don't. And that kind of leaves Gonzaga in a situation where they're pulling in the vast majority. They won't be as singularly impactful in terms of overall units in the Pac-12 because more teams are going to make the tournament. So it makes sense that the split's a little bit lower.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, Andy, I personally, I love this kind of performance-based distribution system, because one of the things that all the non-Big Ten, non-SEC conferences are trying to do right now is figure out, how do we, for our schools, try to get them even in the ballpark of the SEC and the Big Ten. So I know, like, other power conference, like the ACC is trying to figure this out right now, talking about, like, hey, maybe the way we convince Clemson and Florida State to stay is with some kind of performance-based rev share system. And folks, if you're not aware, these NCAA tournament units are worth millions of dollars over the course of multiple years that they're paid out. So this is no small chump change that we're talking about here with this payment. Andy, let's just get into kind of talking about how we, our thoughts and observations about the move itself, now that we got a bunch of the details out the way. You said this in the cold open. I believe it is fully true. I think there are actually, and confusingly to me, quite a few people out there who, for some reason, don't understand how consistent and high level this basketball program has been. And so let me say it definitively as well. Gonzaga is immediately the premier basketball school in this new conference. It is not going away. It's not changing. It's not like, oh, they're jumping up. Can they contend with Oregon State and Washington State, who are in the Pac-12? Gonzaga is a better basketball program year after year after year than either of those. Even when Oregon State accidentally backed their way into the Elite Eight a couple years ago, it's just true. And so, Andy, what I love about it is this gives legitimacy to this new Pac-12 as a basketball conference. And what I love about it, and maybe this can lead us into the next part of the conversation, is that this is the Pac-12 saying loud and clear, we value basketball at the highest level, and we don't have to be constrained by current notions that football is the only way to go forward and make money, right? We've seen Brett Yormark do this with the Big 12, and it's clear that the Pac-12 is prioritizing basketball, and kudos to them for doing so and not getting all hand wrung over like, oh, they don't have football, so we can't add them. This is a great move by the Pac-12.
Yeah, I agree, and I hoped that was the direction they were going to go when they got rebuffed by the American schools in Memphis and Tulane and South Florida, and when the Mountain West kind of mobilized with UNLV and the other programs kind of saying, hey, we're staying here, we're not going anywhere. At that point, the Pac-12's best option was to build a stronger basketball conference and then, figure out how to fill out their football side of things. The fact that they've added Gonzaga before finalizing football is a clear indication how important they view basketball going forward. And I'm curious if it's going to impact Memphis and their decision that they have here, if they're going to get another offer from the Pac-12. There's a lot of different kind of angles that this could potentially create for this situation. But for Gonzaga, it's great to be in a conference that geographically fits. Yep. It's great to be in a traditionally power conference. Obviously, their status in that kind of conversation is a part of this. But what an incredible accomplishment. Before we get into kind of what's next for the Pac-12, what an accomplishment for Mark Few to take over this program in 1999, 2000, as an assistant coach. He'd been there for about a decade. He takes over as the head coach. They've never missed an NCAA tournament in 25 years. They have made 8 straight Sweet 16s. They have been to 2 national championships. And now Mark Few has not only brought that kind of prominence to this program to go from a small Jesuit Catholic school in a small town that, 5 years before he took over as head coach was seriously considering dropping down from the Division I level. He has now taken that program to be an incredibly well-known national brand at the basketball level and has done what Brad Stevens was able to do in admittedly a shorter amount of time at Butler, bringing them from the Horizon League up into the Big East where they now reside. So for Mark Few to have been able to have finally had this accomplishment, he's still missing one thing on that resume. And then this team this year looks pretty primed to be in that conversation for that national championship. But he has now led this program into the Pac-12. It's not the same Pac-12, but that's still an incredible accomplishment for Few and the Zags to now have positioned themselves the way that they have.
Well, and I mean, kind of to your point about, this isn't the Pac-12 that it was, but Andy, let's think about it this way. Since the COVID canceled season, there have been 4 NCAA championship games, 7 different schools, because UConn's made it twice. 2 of those 7 schools reside in this new conference, Gonzaga and San Diego State. The Big 12 is the only other conference that can say we've had 2 different schools join that. That was Kansas and Baylor. Obviously, the Big East kind of does because UConn, but that's only one school, right? And so, I mean, clearly, this conference is legit. And I love your point also about the geography of it all, because if Gonzaga had wound up in the Big East or the Big 12, which would have been great from a basketball standpoint, like from an actual playing the games, that would have been miserable from a travel standpoint. And so if I'm a Gonzaga student athlete right now, I'm like, whew, okay. It's good because it was going to happen. And I'm glad it's something that's staying out on the West Coast. It's great news. And so can this conference continue to make championship games? I think so. And we're going to find out going forward. Now, Andy, is this now a basketball powerhouse league? From what we just said, it seems like they've got at least a little bit of it. Could it entice Memphis to reconsider joining, as you asked earlier? And if not Memphis, who? Because we got to add at least one more school. We'll talk about that coming up here in just a second. Right after I tell you about Roy. Hey, it's time to highlight our Roy Player of the Week. Roy is a new platform that lets fans make contributions directly to their favorite athletes. Download Roy for iOS or Android and enter referral code LOCKEDON, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. No purchase necessary. It's void where prohibited. This week, Andy, we've selected Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe because that was an absolutely bonkers game in Tuscaloosa on Saturday evening. Looked like Alabama was going to run away with this thing. Georgia was basically already driving home to Athens, and then Georgia came storming back. One play later, Milroe gets his team back in the end zone, and Alabama holds on to win. So we're giving Milroe $100 on Roy. If you were as impressed as we were with his performance on Saturday, you can go show him some love too. Just hop on Roy and throw in a few bucks. If everyone pitches in just like $10, it'll add up fast for Jalen. Now, you have the chance to show your appreciation for Bama's QB1 and his standout performance this week, as well as what he'll continue to bring to this program moving forward. So get off the sidelines and into the NIL game with Roy. Andy, we're talking now about, look, here's the situation. The new Pac-12, as we've said, has 8 schools. We knew that they needed to get to 8 schools for FBS viability. However, for football, it's got to be 8 schools that actually have football. Unfortunately, as we're talking about, Gonzaga doesn't have that. So we do want to turn our attention now a little bit more to the conversation of what's next or who's next and how do we do that? Who's it going to be? Andy, you posed the question earlier, and I said it heading into this segment. Is this an opportunity for Memphis to reconsider just a week after they said, nah, we're good, we're staying in the American?
I think that has to be the biggest target for the Pac-12 at this point. Because if you are trying to build a conference that has sustainable success in men's basketball, while also, of course, being FBS eligible, I mean, that's the single most important thing to the Pac-12 right now is getting FBS eligibility. Nothing else matters. Like that is the most important thing. At that point, once you're there, you feel comfortable with that. And I think comfortable for the Pac-12 is probably 9, maybe even 10 football schools. I think they don't want to be minimum 8. They want to be at 9 or 10. Yep. So you get there, then you start to feel more comfortable. But there's only really one prominent program out there the Pac-12 can pursue that has the combination of not only a football team, but a football team that actually raises elevates the conference. And has a basketball program that elevates the conference. There aren't a lot of options out there that really exist in that space, Memphis being the most important one. And I think it's important to recall for those of you who are hearing us talk about Memphis, who are like, didn't Memphis already say no? The Memphis athletic director made it very clear in a statement that they said no to the Pac-12's offer. They did not say no to the Pac-12. And that is a very important distinction. And what it means, I mean, it's not hard to read through the lines here. What it means is Memphis wants more money. And I don't think Gonzaga joining the Pac-12 necessarily means Memphis will accept an invite to the Pac-12 for less money than they initially wanted. They're not going to just turn around and be like, oh, well, you offered us this amount of money. Before we said no, now we're going to say yes because Gonzaga's in the league. That's not how it's going to work. But I do think Gonzaga helps make it more enticing for Memphis to join the league because it is obviously a program that has both football and basketball, but joining a league that has more competition in men's basketball is something that would appeal to Memphis. If I'm the Pac-12, you gotta throw the biggest bag that you can at Memphis, because if you can land this program, your basketball league, which is already very good right now, 6 of the 8 teams in the Pac-12 made the tournament last year. Memphis actually did not make the tournament last year, but they were a very, very good program. I think that has to be the way that you go. There are other options, but most of the other options are either basketball-only schools, which we can talk about, as well as some football schools that would be good additions for the Pac-12, at least would help get them to that FBS number. But like, let's be honest, Texas State, I get the appeal to the Pac-12, but it's not, they're a fine basketball school. They were pretty good in the Sun Belt, but they're not a huge addition to the Pac-12. They're not moving the needle as much as some of the other schools would be. Same with like, if you can pry into the Mountain West again, if UNLV is off the table, can you try to go get New Mexico? Can you try to go get Nevada? Could you go get New Mexico State from Conference USA? Like, they're all football brands that geographically make some sense. They're not great basketball moves. I mean, the Nevada and New Mexico would be New Mexico State, Texas State. It's not really moving the needle from a basketball perspective. Gonzaga now has a vote in the Pac-12, 1 vote out of 8. So they're not going to be able to swing everything in their direction. But you can bet that Gonzaga is going to try to convince the rest of the leadership to prioritize additions that help them from a men's basketball perspective. That doesn't mean the conference is going to turn Texas State away, but I am curious what direction the Pac-12 goes from here, because they have a lot of options and some of them don't seem great, but what direction they go is going to tell us a lot about the future of this conference.
Yeah, Andy, it's so interesting to me overall. And for the record, by the way, I'm right with you on Memphis. I think like that is your goal and that is your aim. That's where you got to move next. Make Memphis tell you no before you get anyone else. And it's similar to, like, let's think about high school recruiting. Like, if you land whoever lands AJ DeBanza in the class of 2025, the consensus #1 player, other guys are going to want to go to that school because AJ DeBanza is there.
Right.
Who is a program similar? Because if I'm a school wanting to maybe make a change and I see that Gonzaga is joining this conference and Memphis is coming, then that is another potential school is going to entice me to want to come too. So it's like, who's a school that is like a needle mover in that regard? Andy, here's a funny thing that we were looking at earlier. This tweet from Tom Fornelli. who said, if the Mountain West and Pac-12 had just merged, given themselves a new name, and added Gonzaga in basketball, that would have been a pretty strong league. And man, there's a lot of truth, Andy, and intrigue to Tom's tweet here. Obviously, it's a hindsight is 2020 thing, but we were looking at that for a while, and it just is so funny now to where we're at that basically had something like that gone through, we wouldn't have maybe had to go through with the death of the Pac-12. You add in what was turning into an even stronger Mountain West, and then, man, the Mountain West, Pac-12, and Gonzaga together, that is a Pacific West Coast powerhouse that I think at some level could be contending with the SEC and Big Ten and not have given up their schools, oh, by the way, to the Big Ten and the ACC, for example, and the Big 12. And so, Andy, I was curious your thoughts on Fornelli's tweet.
Yeah, I don't think Gonzaga joins a Pac-12 if it's just Oregon State, Washington State plus the Mountain West. I don't think Gonzaga joins that league, to be honest with you. I know they joined a league that is Oregon State, Washington State, and half of the Mountain West, so that may seem silly or contradictory in some way, but I don't think that Gonzaga is. They didn't want to compete against Wyoming and San Jose State and some of those kind of bottom feeders in the Mountain West. And I mean, honestly, the Pac-12 paid basically $100 million plus to not add San Jose State and Wyoming and New Mexico and Nevada. Like they paid that money in order to add the premier brands in the Mountain West and not adding the kind of bottom feeder teams in that conference. So I'm not sure Gonzaga would have joined, but I do think that a mix of those leagues would have certainly been an appealing option for. I get the appeal of that. I think Gonzaga is pretty picky about where they were going to end up, but they're certainly hoping now that this Pac-12, the rest of the additions that they make will help them from a basketball perspective, because, and we could talk about it kind of closing out the show, the difference between this current league plus Texas State and Sacramento State versus this current league plus St. Mary's, Grand Canyon, Memphis, and Wichita State is monumental for Gonzaga. It's not as dramatic on the football side of things, but it's monumental for Gonzaga depending on who else comes in that league. So that's, I think, the biggest next question for Gonzaga is, okay, we're in the picture now. We're in this conference. We know it's better than the WCC depth-wise, even with just 8 schools currently. But what else can be done to make this the best league for us to help us continue to be a premier basketball brand and contend for national championship?
Here's what I wish had happened, Andy. As you were talking, this kind of occurred to me. After the Big Ten's initial poaching of the Pac-12, like once they just got USC and UCLA, if the Pac-12 had some wherewithal at that point, the foresight to say, what if we added Gonzaga and a couple top flight Mountain West schools just immediately right then? That would be a whole different conversation, because then you've still got Arizona, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, like that, Colorado. Good grief. That's a whole other ball of wax there. That would have made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, the Pac-12 fumbled the bag pretty intensely at that point, and some of the programs in that. The old Pac-12 really, really cared about the institutions that were being added to the conference, and were anti-BYU, were anti-Boise State, were anti-San Diego State, and I mean, it really bit them in the butt. And if they had the foresight, like you said, we could have a beautiful West Coast basketball powerhouse conference. But I think we'll have to settle for what we're getting now. And honestly, there's a lot of appeal to this, but there's also some cons. I know there's a lot of Gonzaga fans and college basketball fans who aren't as enthusiastic about Gonzaga's decision to leave the WCC to go to the Pac-12. And so we kind of want to talk about what are those pros, what are those cons for Gonzaga joining this league. And we'll close the show talking a little bit about what this means for the WCC. All that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a huge return from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. You can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. National championship odds are out on FanDuel. Gonzaga right now at plus 2,000 odds to take it home in 2025 would be quite fun. If they won a championship while in the WCC, would continue the Pac-12 streak of not winning a championship, would just be a kind of a fun wrinkle to this whole thing. Gonzaga's odds are tied with Iowa State and North Carolina. They are behind Duke, at plus 1,000. UConn and Kansas tied at plus 1,100. And then Houston and Alabama both tied at plus 1,300. Go check out those odds and plenty more all over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Isaac, continuing our conversation here, talking about the big news of the day, the Gonzaga Bulldogs joining the Pac-12 conference starting July 1st, 2026. And like we said, there was some consternation. There was some conversation kind of leading into this, especially not knowing the financials, which we still don't have full details on, and not knowing the full scope of the league. Being able to kind of determine whether this is the right move for Gonzaga is not a question that we can fully answer at this point. But we know there are some pros and we know there are some cons, even without having the full scope. I'll start with a couple pros. I mean, this is a deeper basketball league than WCC. I've said this before on this show. I've said this before on Locked On Zags. I love the WCC. I think the WCC is an underrated, underappreciated basketball conference. I think teams like Santa Clara and San Francisco and LMU are better basketball teams than they get a lot of attention for. But there's no debate. There's no debate. 6 of the 8 teams currently in the Pac-12 made the tournament last year. Sure, if you assume Washington State's going to fall off because they replaced their entire roster and their coach, sure, Utah State's now on their 3rd coach in 3 years. Maybe those 2 teams aren't perennial NCAA tournament teams, but this is a better, deeper, stronger basketball league from a men's basketball perspective than the WCC was. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of other factors that matter. Money matters, geography matters, other sports matter, et cetera, et cetera. Gonzaga wanted to join a better basketball league, and in this move, they've done that.
Andy, a couple pros for me. One of the things I often think about is all the wild non-conference scheduling that Mark Few has to do, just because of the lack of strength in the West Coast Conference. Now, just because he's who he is, and I appreciate this about him so much as a coach, I think he'll still continue to schedule tough non-con schedules because I don't think he's got it in him to not. Plus, the first year in the Pac-12 will be the 3rd year of that Baylor-Gonzaga matchup. So we're at least getting that, But I think this means that he doesn't have to be quite as aggressive in his non-conference scheduling. And I think there are some years where that will be a really helpful thing. The other thing that I think is a big time pro for Gonzaga is there's always this national narrative that we hear all about Gonzaga and we see Gonzaga playing all the time in the non-conference schedule, but then the Bulldogs basically, quote, go away during conference play because a lot of East Coast people don't care about the West Coast Conference or they're not willing to stay up on a Saturday night or whatever it is. But Andy, I think this means now there is less of that. Gonzaga will still be more in the public conscience throughout the entire regular season. And I think that's ultimately a good thing, not only just for Gonzaga, but for the nation as a college basketball loving nation. I think that to me is a really good thing.
Yeah. And regional rivalries, I think, is a factor here too. We talk about Gonzaga as a candidate for the Big 12 or the Big East, and the appeal of those basketball matchups week in and week out is tremendous, but there's not rivalries that really exist there. Gonzaga, Arizona is kind of the closest, and Gonzaga, BYU. I suppose there's 2 in the Big 12 that would have kind of translated over. I'm sure after a few years, Baylor would feel like a rival, Kansas, Houston, etc. But Big East, there's not really any rivalries there. UConn is one of the only teams that beats Gonzaga every time they play them. Gonzaga's had some fun matchups against Creighton, but it's not really a rivalry. But in the new Pac-12, San Diego State and Gonzaga, they're the 2 best West Coast teams in college basketball. That is a tremendous rivalry. They already have scheduled non-conference games against each other. Gonzaga's playing San Diego State in San Diego State this year because Gonzaga is willing to play games on the road in the non-conference slate. That'll eventually be a conference game for them. Pullman's 75 miles away. Boise's like 5 hours away. Their head coach is a former assistant at Gonzaga. So you got a built-in rivalry at Boise. You got a long-time geographic rivalry with Washington State. You got a rivalry with San Diego State. Fresno State and Oregon State are not great basketball programs, but there's a large subset of Gonzaga fans in the Portland area and in the Bay Area, and they still keep games kind of locally. They lose the matchup at Portland. They lose the matchups at San Francisco and potentially at St. Mary's, depending on what happens there, but they keep these matchups with Oregon State and Fresno State. So it really works well for the Gonzaga fan base, who's kind of localized in various kind of metro areas in the West Coast, to kind of still have opportunities to see the team. They're better opponents. Denver area Zags get to see them in Fort Collins, for example. I think it creates a lot of exciting regional rivalries within conference play. And like you said, more people are going to tune into Gonzaga at Colorado State than Gonzaga at LMU or Santa Clara, right? Like you say, Colorado State's fourth or fifth best team in the Pac-12. That game's going to matter more than Gonzaga at LMU. Like it's going to be more interesting. More people are going to tune to it. So it's a better thing for Gonzaga. It's a better thing for college basketball fans. It keeps local regional rivalries kind of intact for Gonzaga for the most part. So it's hard to find negatives. There are some negatives. I think the biggest one is just joining a football conference. There's a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety about not being the top dog. Gonzaga's been the top dog in the WCC for 25 years. I mean, they've literally been at the top of that conference for decades. And to give that up, to put yourself in a position where this conference does seem like they're going to care a lot about basketball, but they're probably never going to prioritize it over football. And I'm sure Mark Few knows that. And I'm sure the Gonzaga staff, athletic director, president, everybody, they get that. They understand that. But that's still a difficult process to have to go through. Like, it's a tough decision to leave something that has been so good to you, has bent over backwards for you, has really gone out of their way to help you and elevate you as a program. And now you're going to a conference that maybe isn't going to treat you the same way.
And that's, I think I'm with you, Andy. That is the biggest potential con for me as well, is the biggest fish in a small pond versus biggest basketball fish in a medium football pond. And so I think that is a potential con. And truthfully, there's just no way of truly knowing until it's going and happening 2 seasons from now. And that's where you just got to kind of take a leap of faith and hope that you've done the right thing for where the landscape is today, which could change literally 5 seconds from now, as we see all the time, Andy. And so, I guess there's some stuff with that.
Last thing that I'll say quickly before we get out here, this is a really tough blow for the WCC. We didn't get into a ton here, but there is rumors that St. Mary's and or Grand Canyon could be considered future additions for the Pac-12. As we said, the Pac-12 has made it clear they're going to prioritize football for the time being. So I don't think we'll hear an announcement about either of those schools leaving anytime soon. But Grand Canyon's set to join the WCC next season. That may never happen. They may end up just jumping straight over to the Pac-12. St. Mary's could potentially be involved as well. That would be nearly a death sentence for the WCC. They'd have to work very quickly to scoop up some schools from the WAC, Cal Baptist, maybe Southern Utah, etc., in order to even stay alive and be viable going forward. But it's tough to see this happen to mid-major conferences. The WCC, if they just lose Gonzaga, they'll be fine. If they keep Grand Canyon and add St. Mary's, honestly, they're going to be great. That's St. Mary's versus Grand Canyon year in and year out is going to be a nice rivalry if those two schools stay. If they do not, Stu Jackson, the commissioner of the WCC, they're going to be in some trouble, and they're going to have some work to do to keep that conference alive going forward. And it's unfortunate to see for a conference that I've loved and followed for a long time, but this is the nature of the beast right now, and Gonzaga had to do what they thought they had to do, and we'll see how much more of an impact it could potentially have on the West Coast Conference.
Man, what a big news story on a Tuesday, October 1st, Andy, where we are a month and 3 days away from the start of the 2024-25 basketball season. Big kudos to Mark Few for, basically this man over the course of the last 2.5 decades has moved his program up into where it is now, joining a bigger conference. That's great stuff. So we're going to continue to keep our eyes on the Pac-12's next moves, the West Coast Conference's next moves, the Mountain West's next move. All of this, man, is still ongoing and is still circling. And so, of course, we're going to keep you abreast of all of this information, all this data as it comes out. And so we're going to have to keep our eyes on it because, as we said, it's always and ever changing. All right, guys, if you have not subscribed to the show on video and audio, make sure you do that. Coming out tomorrow, we will have our UConn preview. It's myself and our Locked On UConn host, Mark Zanetto. Fun conversation there about could we have the first ever three-peat in the modern era, which is still mind-blowing to think about. If you haven't joined our Locked On College Basketball Discord, we would love to have you join us there, where we've been talking about this whole move kind of all morning. And man, it's fun to be a part of. The link is in the show notes. Come on and join us. It's absolutely free, and we'd love to have you there. We want to say always apologies to the Lawyer family, and I guess today apologies to the West Coast Conference. Let's go Wildcats, and until tomorrow, peace.